Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Nisa Johan, and I'm going to be your moderator for this session, 3B Smart Mobility. In this session, we'll discuss further not only data analytics in terms of mobility, but also what aspects can help to build a sustainable mobility in terms of urban innovation. Also, how data can support the decision in policymaking and the interplay between different stakeholders and or different provincial government agencies. I am delighted to introduce the speakers joining us for this session. Our first speaker will be Dr. Philip Christ. Hello, Dr. Philip. Dr. Philip Christ is an advisor on innovation and foresight for the International Transport Forum at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He coordinates innovation and foresight activities for the International Transport Forum, manages the research of the ITF's Corporate Partnership Board, and carries out research for the ITF. Our second speaker will be Mr. Aditya Luhut Sibarani, Master of Science. Mr. Luhut is a member of MTI Jakarta chapter. He holds a master's degree in transport planning from the University of Leeds, where he studied mobility as a service, implementation as well as its commercial and governance complexities in the greater Jakarta area. Our third speaker will be Ms. Irani Handalia. Mr. Rudy Satari, the initial speaker, couldn't make it to this session, so he will be replaced by Ms. Irani Handalia from the head of traffic management from Jakarta Provincial Transportation Agency. Hello to our speakers. Thank you very much for joining us here in this online event. For the attendees here with us, please feel free to use this question and answer feature. We will be able to discuss your questions in the end of the session. So moving on, our first speaker will be Dr. Philip Christ. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just setting up the screen sharing right now. I'd like to, can you see?
It's loading.
All right, let me just full screen it. And it should be fine in just a second. So thank you for inviting the International Transport Forum at the OECD to present some of our thinking around the connection between smart cities, smart mobility, and data. One of the things that we do for our member countries is to provide advice on how to deal with policy problems. And of course, the smart city and smart mobility is at the crux of that. One of the things that we've been doing is trying to provide guidance to our ministers on a range of issues that they weren't necessarily confronted with in the past. These are just a list of some of the items that we have had to help our member countries address. And as you can see, there are a lot of these new developments, new technologies, and the deployments of these technologies involve data. They also can be all brought into the chapeau, if you will, of the smart city and smart mobility deployments. And in the context of this year's G20, the ITF, the International Transport Forum at the OECD, authored this document, which was looking specifically at providing advice to G20 digital economy ministers on how to anticipate and put in place policies that leverage all the benefits that the smart cities and smart mobility can create, while managing some of the disbenefits that can come out of these deployments. When we think about smart cities, we often have this idea of an optimization problem of trying to find a way to increase the efficiency of the city so that it meets our needs. And this efficiency and optimization often leads to a very digital-heavy, technology-heavy vision of the city. And one of the things to keep in mind is that the whole notion of the smart city derives actually from architectural design around smart buildings. And the idea there, as it is also with smart cities in the common discussion around this, is how do you create a city, or rather a machine for living, a building for living, and in the case of cities, a set of interlinked machines for living. And this is the real optimization problem that has been at the heart of many smart city discussions and deployments. But it's important to remember that a city is different than a building. And a lot of the value that is generated by people crowding or coming to cities is generated at the margins of built space, at the margins of planned space, is not part of the optimization, but actually is beyond the optimization of the city. There's a level of chaos, a level of messiness in cities that is essential to cities' success. Now, these can be managed better, clearly, and technology has a role there. But we shouldn't think that by eradicating these, we've built better cities. In fact, we've built what historically have been less attractive, less productive cities. When we think about smart mobility, a lot of times we focus on the movement part of mobility. Of course, that is at the heart of mobility. But mobility and movement only has value if you consider when mobility and movement stops, when people get out of their vehicles and meet, interact with each other, create jobs, ideas, when they deliver goods. It is that part of the smart mobility equation that we can't forget. And at the heart of that isn't mobility, but it's access. How do we better improve access to our cities, both through mobility, but through other means as well? We, in the context of the G20 work, have a definition for smart cities. I think it's important to recognize that it goes beyond technology and looks at social inclusion, quality of life, accessibility, all these aspects that are necessary to fold into how we believe we can make cities function better or smarter. And digital technologies, of course, have a role, but they are not necessarily at the center of the deployment of these. It's really thinking about the goals and not the tools, or rather the goals first and the tools afterwards. What we can say is that there is no smart mobility without an appropriate data governance framework that's put into place. And that is clearly what we see across our member countries. There is a lot going on in cities, and a lot of what is going on in terms of movement and mobility generates data. But I think we need to keep in mind what data can and can't do in support of smart outcomes and better outcomes for cities. The first thing to keep in mind is that not all that is important for policy is datafied, is accessible in digital format. There's a lot of value that goes on in cities that doesn't involve digital transactions. Not all data is important for delivering on public policy outcomes. And although we do focus a lot on privacy issues, not all data is privacy relevant. On the skill side, we have to keep in mind that not all actors, both on the public sector and the private sector, have the technical capacity to manage and process privacy-related data when that data is in fact used to deliver on public policy outcomes. And not all data has the same value for all. We have to recognize that there's a heterogeneous set of audiences, and for each of them, they have a different view on what value data provides. I mean, I can break it down into four. There are other ways of breaking it down, but we can think of data, the value of data to operators to improve their own operations. We can think of the value of data to third-party aggregators of that data, because they can generate value by selling data insights based on that. It has, of course, data has a value for people because they use it to access services that they value. And data has value for public authorities to carry out their mandates for citizens. Now, what I'll focus on in the last few minutes of this talk is on this last aspect, which is the data governance aspects that are in particular important for public authorities and access to data and data sharing frameworks in support of public policy making. As for any public operation or public display of governance, we have to think of the principles that guide that. And I think in terms of public value data sharing, we need to think of a few basic primary principles that are useful in framing the policies around data governance. The first is that because governments have an ability to compel action, we really have to think about streamlining what data is shared with public authorities. And so this aspect of data minimization is important. Purpose definition for people to trust and operators and commercial actors to trust sharing data with public authorities. There has to be a set purpose. Now, this may run at odds sometimes with the fact that a lot of value for data can be discovered once data has been shared and once we look at that data. But again, for public policy, it's important that we limit the purpose, at least at first, experiment maybe with new uses, but then think about widening the kind of purposes that we collect data for. Privacy by design is key going forward, and it should be hard baked into our approaches. Transparency as well. Why is the data being provided? How will it be managed? And when will it be finally destroyed or put to archive. And that's the last point here, is that we have to have information that's shared broadly and understood by all parties on handling, processing, retention, and destruction rules. The one thing that we have come across most often when we think about data governance frameworks is that there isn't a clear mapping between those kinds of public policy objectives and specific data asks that public authorities have for private operators. And this is something that we're working within the ITF to address. On the one hand, public authorities have high-level policy objectives they need to deliver on efficiency, accessibility, use of public space, on safety, on equity, environment, and competition. And to do that, they have a number of tools and methods at their disposal. They can monitor, they can use the data for planning purposes, they can use the data for actively managing transport, and they can use the data for enforcing. And these are the kind of tools that they have to carry out the high-level public policy objectives I just talked about. Now, when it comes to the specific data ask, these outcomes to tools to the specific data should be mapped in a clear, transparent, and purposeful way. So, in line with a safety outcome, what type of data is necessary? What level of aggregation is helpful? What type of latency? Real-time, daily, monthly statistics? What kind of access control protocols do you put in place? Maybe for extremely privacy-revealing data that's necessary for enforcement. Not everyone should have access to that, and that certainly should not become open data. What sharing protocols with other government agencies? What period of storage, and what final destruction method? All of these are important to keep in mind. And I'll finish with showing you what that kind of looks like in a conceptual framework. On the one hand, you may have a policy objective like equity. And the regulatory task, the way that you carry this out, is to ensure that mobility services, including public transport or other types of mobility services, are present in all areas in sufficient number. Then, once you have that, what specific data do you need to carry out that regulatory task? Well, you don't need real-time data for that, and you don't even need daily data. Monthly data that's aggregated to the level of zones, looking at start and end trip data, is sufficient. Obstruction of public space. Now, this is another public policy outcome. There you want to enforce parking restrictions. Well, there you actually need to know where devices are. And you probably need to know this in near real time. But the only information you need are those potential data points that represent a vehicle that is in contravention of the rules. So there's some upstream data cleaning that's necessary. The public authorities don't need all the data. They just need the probable cases where there is a vehicle that requires some kind of enforcement action. So this kind of mapping is at the heart of what we see going forward in terms of the public-private data sharing relationship. The last 2 points. We have to keep in mind that a lot of this data is being ingested by algorithm-based automated decision-making systems, and that clearly something that most governments have not anticipated and are not positioned well to govern. And by being positioned well to govern, that means understanding how these systems operate and understanding if, because maybe they don't need to, if and where they should intervene to ensure that these systems are delivering on public policy outcomes. And the final point is that there is no smart mobility or smart data governance framework without a guiding vision of shared societal outcomes. And this, I would put forward, is at the heart of public policy action, creating that vision for what a smart city delivers for people, what smart mobility delivers for all actors. That is at the forefront, going back to what I said earlier. And then after that, we can start thinking about the ways in which we put in place different data sharing principles, data engagement with private sector, or business-to-business data sharing mandates. These come after the creation of this shared vision. And that is something that, again, we find that many, but not all, public authorities have been a bit late to address because of the speed with which new data or new technologies have been deployed in the last 10 to 15 years. And there's a bit of catch-up to be played here. So I'll stop there. I want to thank you for listening, and I look forward to Aditya's and Rudy's further presentations. And your question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Philip, for your insights on smart mobility. Moving on, we will proceed with our second speaker, Mr. Aditya. As the Urban Mobility Senior Researcher in Indonesia Transportation Society, Mr. Aditya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nisa. Would you mind presenting my
Oh, yes.
slide? Yeah.
So I will
Or I can do it
share
myself.
the slide.
Okay, sure.
Okay, can you see the slide clearly?
Not yet. Okay, it's ongoing. All right. Thank you very much, Nisa, and the whole team for inviting us to join this. Shown to you is the presentation that I've prepared as a call for local challenges in smart mobility in Jakarta. My name is Aditya Lochibarani, as you can call me Aditya. I'm representing the Indonesia Transportation Society, or MTI, for the chapter. Next slide. Next slide, please, Nisa. Sorry.
Wait.
Okay, Nisa, could I just present myself then?
Okay. There's some errors in the connection.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. It happens every time.
Yes, I'm very sorry.
Okay, can you guys see my screen?
But we also see Nisa's.
Okay.
We could see your screen. I did,
Okay,
Is it
then.
still on my screen?
but there's still Nisa's screen.
Yeah, maybe you need to remove the screen sharing from your side, but Nisa?
Yes, I am trying to. There are some network issues. I can't appear to cancel.
Okay, other way, can you, the other can see my screen?
So for people who are joining, I just, on the upper right-hand part of Aditya's screen, there's a full screen option. And if you click on that, then you get there. There you
Okay.
go.
All right. So for everyone, I think there would be no problem.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll continue this. So a little bit about MTI. Is the Indonesian Transportation Society for professional people, experts, academics, practitioners, bureaucrats, who are driven by awareness for social responsibility for transport, especially the sustainable transport development. The organization has been around for about 25 years, so it's quite an old one. But the team members keep on regenerating. For example, I'm one of the young members of MTI in Jakarta chapter. So I'll start with this, the challenges in realizing smart mobility. Echoing what Philip already mentioned, it's not just about the ICT. So the definition that I took here is the integration of a physical, digital, and human system for a mobility system. And the objective is, in general, to deliver a sustainable, prosperous in terms of economic and inclusive future for the citizen. So smart mobility is not similar to ICT-based mobility, but a whole concept of a sustainable mobility added with ICT element. On the right side, you can see the wheel for a smart city. This one is being used by Jakarta Smart City as the principal guidelines for the smart city concept. As for the smart mobility, the first point is about the mixed modal access. So it's not. So the idea is to have like a list of options for people to move from one place to another. So you will not be only given no option. For example, you can only use car to access an area, but it has to be a mixed modal access. The second element is about the prioritization of clean and non-motorized option. For example, like walking and cycling. And the last bit is about the integration of ICT in the surface of transport. So these are the principal guidelines that I would use for the whole presentation, and I'll discuss about three things: challenges. The first one is the context of transport. Second one is context in the governance element, and also in data and solutions, specifically targeted to Jakarta context. So what you see here is the typical what do you call it? Illustration of a peak hour traffic in Jakarta or Greater Jakarta. You have a congested roads, congested train service, a crowded place where people do not have like adequate space, and it's being a problematic issue for the past 1 year in the COVID era. And then traffic has started to go back to the before the COVID era. And then it's hot. The temperature of the urban area is very hot. It's also polluted because of the traffic emissions. It's also unsafe. Unsafe in terms of the road safety accidents, also in terms of security and safety, crimes, harassments, and such things like that. However, these maybe are going to be eradicated soon. Knowing that Jakarta has been doing a lot right now. Jakarta has received the Sustainable Transport Award for 2021 recently, and there has been a lot of initiatives going on in providing public transport, for example, some measures in traffic management, and so on and so forth. So I'm looking forward for the next presenter to describe more about that. But this is the general idea of the challenges that we face in Jakarta and Greater Jakarta area. By saying that, it's actually a battle for space and an extra minute. Knowing and being a commuter myself in Jakarta, any minute is actually very, very crucial. For example, one thing could be waiting for another train to come, which would be an extra 15 minutes to 20 minutes, or it could be an extra traffic light if you miss the green light, for example. And this kind of issue has been going around for so long that you can see the first, the three donuts over here, the change of mode share in Greater Jakarta. The motorcycle and private cars are somehow now becoming the majority from previously a minority in the mode share. It's about 75% in 2018 of the trips in Greater Jakarta area is the private cars and motorcycles. In some areas like Surabaya, for example, it's even worse, like 80 to 90%. The idea is that the ever-increasing number of vehicles in traffic, as you can see on the left side, is also exacerbated with the population growth very fast in the past 10 years. Low barrier for vehicle purchase. It's very easy for you to buy a motorcycle and to buy cars with very low down payment or initial payment. And also there's a complexity in the employment and economic output from the vehicle manufacturing. So far as that, recently there's a call for the reduction of down payment and tax for vehicle and vehicle purchase, which will help the manufacturing to keep on going during the pandemic era. But this kind of the idea is on the national level, which maybe Jakarta could not do so much in terms of the vehicle production and influx. But this is a big challenge. You might not be able to deal with the aspiration to get 60% to 70% of the mode share for public transport in 2030, as aspired by the DKI Jakarta province, without addressing the ownership of vehicles and the access of the private vehicles. The second part on the bottom right, you can see, is the public transport coverage and journey times and reliability. There's an issue of access to well-connected transit hub, for example. Even though you can argue that the access to minivans or angkot, and then some Jaklingko connection of microbus, and even the BRT bus itself is pretty good, 50% to 80%, but it's not the main transit hub that will lead you to like main job location, for example. It's quite like a bees network, needs you to go here and there, and through the congestion area, they will lead you for about like 1 hour to 2 hour traffic journey times, which is quite problematic. But if you live in Jakarta, you expect that as a normal things. But if you travel abroad, for example, and you see that is actually Jakarta is on the worst side of the world, it needs to be solved. And also the last bit is about the missing dedicated lanes for sustainable modes. We've been calling for more dedicated lanes for BRTs, for example, like not being intervened by cars, for example, or by other modes of transport, and to also have a cycling lanes and good pedestrians, which are actually currently being developed by the DKI Jakarta government. So that's what I say, that there might be some change in the next following years. Next challenge is about the intergovernmental collaborations. It's not a lonely fight. You cannot just mention Jakarta by itself or on itself as an isolation. Jakarta is actually part of the greater Jakarta area. It's center of economic activities and national government administration. In fact, many of the public officials in DKI Jakarta are actually living outside of DKI Jakarta in the nearby area, like Bekasi, for example, Bogor, and Depok. And there's about like 1 to 4 millions of influx of people to DKI Jakarta. You need to address the end-to-end journey experience from where they live to where they work, which could be across the provinces. And also the increasing suburbanization to the peripheral area. So people are going outside of this actual area, and the journey times actually tripled or doubled or whatever it is, but it becomes a big challenge to move people to Jakarta outside. And also there's an imbalance in fiscal capacity. It's a very big issue, knowing that DKI Jakarta has a very big budget, and then cities right now do not have enough money to keep the bus service alive in their own city. So this kind of imbalance create an imbalance of service as well, which in the end will create an inequality of services. Also, there's an issue in overlapping national and DKI Jakarta's interests. DKI Jakarta might right now encourage for more like cycling and walking and public transport, while national government, the performance of logistics, for example, is quite tremendous. That the idea of having more highways like outer ring road and more outer ring roads and more outer ring roads are actually very demanding. And how to balance this is quite a big challenge, knowing that we need to improve the mode share of public transport. We cannot just keep on building more and more roads, especially the toll roads that you need to pay. And also there's a challenge of specialized functional roles in Jakarta, like the department that leads the highway infrastructure development are different with the transport services regulator, for example, and different with the planning department, and different with the people leads on the information and perhaps on the smart city development. So this kind of silos versus the multidisciplinary collaboration is something that DKI Jakarta needs to deal with. It's something of the discussion within the smart governance that are actually quite interested to look at and dig more about that. The way of working the government will lead to the smart mobility realization, and that's actually one of the fight that DKI Jakarta needs to be smart in dealing with that, including the way to engage with the academic sector and not just let them talk in the media, for example, but also to invite them to criticize the government or the delivery of smart mobility by providing grants for research, for example, platform for them to give feedbacks. And also I'll jump to the community and citizens, providing kind of a smart way for them to raise their voices, like a map that is something of an example, like a map that they can pinpoint and then put their comments. For example, this is a unsafe area that you need to change. There's a pavement issue here and there, and this is something that I think is now being delivered by Jaki system, and there's a need to grow that to a bigger kind of usage in Jakarta and bigger services as well. And also the business sector to not only leave them to do their own business and then govern them later on, but actually to have them regulated or led somehow that would end up in the objectives of the government being met. So the government will have the role as a leader and also empower the growth, justice, and sustainability. That's a call for DKI Jakarta. Echoing what Philip already mentioned about how the data is being used, this simplistic way to represent that, when the data waits, there are a lot of data in DKI Jakarta right now. I'm waiting to see how far it's being used. Public transport and toll roads that has been used to monitor the growth of passengers in the current times for quite long. CCTVs has been around support and the traffic management, but there are other kind of data that are being around and wait to be used for policy making and for interventions in law of measures, for example. How is it being used? How far is it being used? How wide it is? And how the government can attract people to actually use this and benefit the whole society in general. This is one of the critics that I would love to share, and I'd love to see from the next presenter. Some of the smart mobility initiatives that have figured out or identified are actually pretty comprehensive. A big challenge is actually to connect all of this to reach the objectives, not just doing one small things after another and then try to claim that as a one big thing of a smart mobility per se, but it's the way you actually try to lead into a smart city objectives with all of these measures one by one, not just one initiative after initiative, but one integrated initiatives. And I'll end this with the slides. The first one is the addressing transport disadvantage. How is your smart mobility do not exclude people with physical disabilities, for example, those with blind vision, those with mobility limitation, for example. And how is your smart mobility in DKI Jakarta do not exclude people that do not have access to smartphone, for example. Many of the solutions are actually based on smartphone and internet things. But how do you deal with people that do not have access to it, knowing that in Jakarta a lot of people are actually quite disadvantaged in terms of technology? And also in terms of economic, how is it catering the people that do not have enough money to pay for such a service or to access that, or to access education that will help them to understand the services? How do you like the picture that Philip shared, how do you actually benefit people that are outside of the study area, so forth? And how do you ensure the safety for women, for example, on psychological part? How do you ensure that people that live, for example, in doing the night shift will be benefited from the smart mobility in the temporary aspect? And how do people living in a very crowded area or in a very remote area, a special aspect, how can they be benefited from the smart mobility? So it's not just providing a solution for a problem and then forgetting about anything else, but actually how to have a comprehensive solution for smart mobility. And the last thing is about this resiliency. What if their electricity and communication infrastructure fall out? It happening sometimes in Jakarta, and sometimes the mobility kind of shut off and people will go back to the private vehicles. How about cybersecurity? How about privacy attack? How do you deal with that? Indonesia is not very much concerned about that, in my opinion. Several attacks and theft in terms of data of privacy in some e-commerces have been around, and there's no issue. There's no response to that much. And how to deal with natural disaster that happen maybe every now and then, every year. How to actually eradicate that, and if not, how to mitigate that. So these are kind of some thoughts, foods for thoughts in terms of the challenges in smart mobility. And I'd love to discuss more and explore more after the next presentation during Q&A. That's from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sibarani, for the insights on the topic. And now we will proceed with the third speaker, Ms. Irani Handalia, the Head of Traffic Management in the Jakarta Provincial Transportation Agency. Ms. Handalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share the screen. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Good evening. First of all, thank you for the opportunity that's given to me. In this evening, I want to present a topic about our goals in transportation sector is the realization of safe, adequate, modern, integrated, environmentally and affordable transportation facilities and infrastructure for all citizens of Jakarta. And the indicators are reducing the traffic jams numbers and increasing the percentage of public transportation modal share. Our legal foundation are Local Regulation number 5 of 2016 about establishment and composition of regional apparatus for the special capital regions of Jakarta, and the Governor Regulation number 270 about organization and work procedure of Jakarta Transport and our function is carry out the development, guidance, monitoring, control, and evaluation of the transportation system in Jakarta. In this diagram, we can see the different section of transportation agency in Jakarta. My responsibility in this office, myself work in traffic department, and my current position now is head of management traffic section, which my duty are to control and monitor and evaluate the traffic performance. As I mentioned earlier in the previous slide, the indicator of our goal in medium terms of local development planning of Jakarta is to reduce the number of traffic jam in Jakarta. And the policies to reduce the congestion are optimization public transport use based on traffic demand management, pull strategy, and then improves accessibility and mobility of integrated modes of transportation, popularize the mass transit system, high occupancy vehicle, and then promote using pedestrian facilities and promote a clean and healthy transportation system. Odd-even plate numbers of car policy is one of the efforts to control the mode of transportation that being implemented by Jakarta provincial government, which applies to 25 main roads in Jakarta. As we can see, the data used by Jakarta Transportation Agency are speed data of 25 main roads that we have from Google Map application that provided by Jakarta Smart City Office, and then speed data for 18 arterial roads on the outer side of Jakarta, and then mobility data, and motorized bicycle traffic volume data, bicycle traffic volume data, and passenger per mode data. The first picture is diagram about velocity, and the data is from the Google form that we have from the Jakarta that I get from the Jakarta Smart Office, and then the second picture is about the chart that analyzing the result doing by us to evaluate the traffic performance. And the output of the analyze we used to make the policy.
Ini presentasinya nggak ada ya.
And then speed data of 25 main section used for the traffic performance monitoring process, especially measuring the effectiveness of implementing odd-even policies.
I don't know.
Especially during the COVID pandemic, can be used as a tool to monitor congestion points in Jakarta so that it can be used as an indicator of the performance of the transportation agency in successfully dealing with the reduction of congestion points. And then we also use the speed data of 18 arterial segments outside Jakarta that it's used for monitoring traffic performance in suburban areas of Jakarta, especially to determine in and out mobility. The mobility data monitor the mobility of the population of Jakarta province, especially when COVID could be seen, the percentage of people movement to public.
I'm sorry, Miss Natalia.
Yes.
It appears that we cannot see your slide. We're trying to, if we can help you to share the screen. Would you mind waiting?
Okay. So I should close with it. Wait.
I told you.
Okay, so while we wait, we should proceed with the questions.
Okay.
I actually have a question for all of the speakers, aimed to all of the speakers. So I'm gonna tell the question, and then maybe Dr. Philip Chris can answer first, and then Mr. Sibarani, and then Ms. Handalia. The question is, in terms of smart mobility in city management, for a city like Jakarta that relies so much on cars, how do we fight the dominance of cars here in Jakarta? And how to make this city more biking and walking friendly in such a limited space?
Well, I'm terribly looking forward to the rest of the presentation, so I hope we get the screen sharing working. So I can see them. I'll answer very quickly while we're getting that going. I think that there's several things to keep in mind. The first is that when we think about transport in a region, cars definitely have a role to play. We didn't come into the situation because cars were not valuable to people. We got to where we are now because cars are valuable to people. The question is to what extent are cars valuable to a city or to millions of people when there are millions of cars? So I think one of the things we've seen in the past is that from a transport policy perspective, we've intervened mainly on how we can deliver travel time savings, because we thought that correctly, in many cases, travel time was what was rare for individuals, and that's certainly something that individuals value. But the aggregate travel time doesn't necessarily translate into an aggregate value for a whole city. What's really rare in many cities is space. And so on the one hand, you have individuals that are thinking about how do I optimize my time. On the other hand, we should have cities thinking about how do we optimize space. And in some instances, especially in core areas and at certain times of the day, cars are the most space inefficient use of public space. And so there's already that shift in thinking about space, public space management, and public space allocation as a new way of thinking about transport planning interventions that move away from only seeking to improve travel time savings. Not that they're not important. It's just not what's most important in areas where we have the most congestion. The second thing is if we have cars now in our cities, and motorcycles to be clear, it's because we've built our cities for cars and secondarily for motorcycles. There's a real link between the built environment and how people choose their travel modes in that built environment. And I think that going forward, and we're just in the middle of hearing it from the city of Jakarta, where we see that cities are starting to question that allocation of space and the role of the built environment. And I think going forward, thinking about where it makes sense, restricting the access of cars to certain parts of the city at certain times of day is the right way forward. When we think about the alternative, public transport, it is not sufficient alone to provide the high level of accessibility that cars provide, especially in uncrowded conditions. And so you have to think of the tandem between public transport in the modes that can best be used to access public transport. And in many cases, that's going to be walking, but not only. But it may also be cycling, it may be Gojeks, it may be a number of other types of modes or services. But those two, public transport and these other modes, have to be brought together. And that's where the smart layer, the digital layer, can help. It's not the only way to bring those two together. But so that's, in my mind, I mean, there's a lot to say. The two main shifts, moving away from travel time savings as being a reflection of what we are trying to deliver for cities, to better use of public space at certain times and in certain parts of the city. And the second thing is rethinking the way in which we build our environment or act on the built environment to favor modes that are more space efficient, including public transport, walking, cycling, and in many cases, even motorcycling, although there's a real safety issue that has to be addressed there as well.
Okay, from my side, maybe. So I would say it's in more localized knowledge is that DKI Jakarta has been developed as a highway
Thank you very
central.
much, Mr. Philip, for your answer. And as we were all waiting for, I'm going to work on trying to share the presentation of Ms. Handalia.
I like what you're saying, Aditya. So let's come back to that afterwards.
Okay,
Yes.
we'll go back to that afterwards. Okay, we're having some technical issues. I'm very sorry for the inconvenience. Okay, here we go. Can you see my screen clearly?
No,
Not yet?
no, I can't.
Yes.
Yes, now.
Okay, great.
Maybe we can start.
From which one would you like to start?
Speed data flow. I think is in a page. I next.
Okay, speed data flow.
Before maybe. Okay. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. As we can see, the first picture diagram is about the velocity. We get the data is from Google Form from the Jakarta Smart City Office, and then the data we analyzing result to evaluate the traffic performance. And then the output of the analysis we use to make the policy. Next. Yes. The speed data of 25 main section used for the traffic performance monitoring process, especially measuring the effectiveness of the implementing the odd-even policies, especially during the COVID pandemic right now, and also can be used as a tool to monitor congestion points in Jakarta, so that it can be used as indicator of the performance of the transportation agency in successfully dealing with the reduction of congestion points. Next. There's also speed data of 18 arterial segments outside Jakarta. The traffic performance monitoring process, it's used for monitoring traffic performance in suburban areas, especially to determine in and out mobility. Next. And then also there is a mobility data that of the population of Jakarta province. During this COVID pandemic, we can see the percentage of people movement to public places. Next. We also have the data from the DKI Jakarta CCTV. Here are the example. We use this data is to count the traffic volumes in Jakarta City's road. Next. So the traffic volume that we have, we calculate it, and then we analyze it, and so we can use it to make some policies. Next. Nah, there's also ATCS. Next. Now there's we have three cameras in Jakarta in three areas, so we can calculate the volume of the traffic in some of Jakarta area. Next. And we also have a variable message sign that inform the traffic condition in Jakarta. Okay, that's all from my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Handalia, for the very insightful slides.
You only have 10 minutes.
So moving on, proceeding with the question, we only have 10 minutes. So Mr. Sibarani, maybe you could proceed by answering the question. Do you want me to repeat it?
Okay, thank you very much for the time. Yeah, thank you very much, Ibu Ira, as well, for presenting that. Yeah, it's kind of confirming what I've already mentioned before in a more sophisticated way and a more comprehensive way. So the idea that DKI Jakarta and Great Jakarta is very much a car-oriented or private mobility, private vehicles-oriented or dependent city is very much a reality, but we see it actually kind of moving toward a better solutions or better conditions in the next maybe 10 years. The arrival of MRT Jakarta, for example, LRT Jakarta, and the upcoming LRT Jabodebek is actually kind of giving a perception and also confidence that there will be a change in terms of the mobility in DKI Jakarta. And we have already seen the arrival of Ojek as well, Gojek and Grab ride-hailing services actually quite impacting the sales of vehicles in the DKI Jakarta area. So this is one of the sentiment that I see as a positive in terms of the mobility change within DKI Jakarta. However, it's just one thing. It's not a thing that will basically change everything. The reduction of sales doesn't mean that people will change into public transport, but maybe people just use car less, or they use car they already have. So the next thing would be how to change the shape of DKI Jakarta and the Great Jakarta area. We know that the business center or CBDs in DKI Jakarta is very much car-oriented lanes. So if you see the Sudirman Tamrin, for example, those buildings, the big buildings, are actually right next to a big highway that is always congested lanes. And the second CBD in the TBC Matubang area is also kind of similar. It's always cars and motorcycles, a very big highway. It's very hard for you to cross the roads without circling the whole area. So this kind of big areas need to change their shape as well. How to make it more friendly to pedestrians, to cyclists. And by doing so in the very a big and prominent area, or the center or the core of the city, as mentioned by Mr. Philip, it will give a sort of a confidence to start to do it in other areas as well. One another example is that right next to the big highway, or the big highway of Sudirman Tamrin, is actually small streets that very much a typical like a European city centers. Small human scale, people are crowding to buy retails, for example. It's right next to the big highway. So why not change the big highway to be more like that? And knowing that MRT Jakarta is already there, for example, the first phase, it could be like a game changer for the whole mobility sector in DKI Jakarta. So going back to the question of how to make DKI Jakarta less car dependent or less motorcycle dependent, is to change the shape of the city one by one step after another, and providing the public transport as in a package with another restriction of the road access. And by doing so, then the confidence will lift up, and it will be easier for the government to do that and replicate that approach to other areas within the city.
Thank you so much, Mr. Aditya. Now moving on, Mrs. Handalia, would you like to answer the question?
Okay, thank you. How to make city more biking and walking? Additionally to Mr. Aditya, we create more infrastructure to support cyclists and pedestrians. We have now 63 existing bike line kilometer, and plan to make other until 500 kilometers in total bike line in Jakarta. And we also make a permanent bike line in Sudirman Tamrin. And now we plan to create a low emission zone area in Old City to increase more people to walk and to reduce the emission in that area and in general in Jakarta.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Handelia, for the answer. Now we'll move on to the last question of this session, and it's aimed to Dr. Philip. It's from Limas Numan. He asked, based on your experiences, what are the common mistakes done by the government in making regulation about mobility data?
Well, I think there's a common challenge. Let's not call it a mistake, but a common challenge in dealing with data, and that's understanding what data says and what it doesn't say, and what it can do and what it can't do. I'll give you an example. The kind of data that we've been following and many others have been following, looking at, for example, mobility analytics in cities or in countries following COVID, have largely been sourced from a number of operators, including Google, including Apple, and we have made policies based on that, or at least try to assess what has been the impact of COVID based on that. All that data shows is, in fact, when people asked for a route in a city, what type of mode were they thinking of using, or what was the mode that they specified they were asking the route for. So by default, that strips away almost all habitual travel. Because when you walk out the door, you don't need to know necessarily how to go around the corner to the shop or even to go to work. You may want to check and see what congestion levels are like, but not in all cases. So we have to be clear that data only shows a partial representation of reality. And we have to understand that limitation before we make policy on it. I'll give another example. There's a lot of valuable, potentially valuable data from mobile network operators that's based on cell tower triangulation. Now that is really helpful data if you think that a large percentage of your population is actually using smart mobile devices, and in many cases they are. But what that data doesn't show is trips within the cell, which can be as large as a kilometer, or in many urban areas less, but it strips out all short trips. So whatever information you get from that is going to be biased to longer trips, which is exactly what we see, because when people act on that, then they forget that a lot of the mobility that's happening is up to 500 meters, up to a kilometer in distance. And so that isn't captured in that data. And a final thing on what data shows and doesn't show is what it doesn't show is what travel isn't happening. It is only an observation of things that are moving, devices that are moving when it comes to digital data, not people necessarily. And so there are a lot of people who aren't traveling now, for example, us in front of the screen for teleworking and telepresence, but also people who don't dare travel because of their age, either old or young. They don't want to go out at a time of day when it's most unsafe. And that's important information for public policy to understand. Where are people being forced out or pushed out of the city or public spaces? And that isn't captured in the data. And I think the final thing, and this is a word of caution because we see it over and over again, there is an expectation, and I understand the expectation because it's compelling, an expectation that if we only get the data right or the technology right, then we'll be able to change behavior in a good way to make it more sustainable, to create a more efficient, prosperous city. And I think in one way it's easy to do that because the data is perhaps more accessible than a lot of the other things that we have to manage in terms of making a successful, prosperous, equitable city. But I would say it's the reverse. I think that unless you get the city right first, then data will not really help you change behavior. And so that means the built environment. That means this kind of allocation of space that we're talking about. That means the kind of some of the initiatives that we've heard from the city of Jakarta. That hard, concrete, material interaction and impact on the city is necessary to enable data-led behavior change. Not the other way around, because if you have an app that tells you go to this public transit station and then travel to here, and getting there you feel is quite unsafe, and then the service level that you get from the public transport operator is subpar, then your experience is such that you will not do that many times again. If everything is built to support that choice, like literally built, not in data, but hard built, then you may repeat that. and change your behavior over time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Philip Chris, Mr. Sibarani, and Ms. Handalia. Thank you, everyone. With this, we end the Block B section of the deep dives. However, do not go just yet, as we will now proceed with the closing and next steps for smart change, multi-stakeholder and policy dialogue in Jakarta. See you in the final session. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.